This story of a storm in my life is really a two-part story. The first part occurred when my employer invited me to stop by the office, and they basically, in a kind of a budget crunch reorganization, they laid me off. First time in 30 years that I had ever had any such experience. And looking back now, I realize I really took that for granted. But when I got that news, I was filled with a variety of emotions, with helplessness, kind of a numbness. I felt confused and full of questions. God, what's happening? Why is this happening? How am I going to provide for my family and our needs? And so it was a very difficult time. But I immediately focused on finding a new job, 8 hours more than 8 hours a day. Sent resumes out, hundreds of resumes, looking for a job, and with no success. I was really devastated. I was dismayed and disappointed in myself, and I felt like a failure. We moved forward, and in the spring, exactly a year later, after I was laid off, the same company hired me back. So I went back to work, and life was good again. That's the first part. Little did I know the things that I learned and experienced in part one would pay dividends later in how I approached a similar event. Well, January, the next month, I got called into my employer's office and again was laid off. But the moment of that news coming to me, I felt an unbelievable peace in my spirit. I knew God was with me. Actually, the guy laying me off, my boss, was more nervous about it than I was. And I just felt at peace. I knew God was going to take me through this, and He had a plan. And He did. 4 weeks later, a guy I used to work with said, "Hey, I got a job for Greg." 8 weeks after being laid off, I had a new job, stepping into a more fun job and paying a lot more money. And so I'm here to say God fulfilled the desires of my heart, and He was there to keep us safe. About 25 years ago, in this sanctuary, I signed up for a prayer vigil. The last 5-minute segment, it said, "Be silent, listen to hear God's voice." So I focused on that, and I remember sitting there, and I looked up at that stained glass window, and there was Peter reaching up to Jesus. He's standing on the water, reaching to pull him up. And at that moment, I heard God's voice say to me, "Greg, I will never leave you nor forsake you." And I just sat there, just awestruck. And I remember that time, to me, that's one of those God wink moments that has assured me that He will be with me. And my story of these struggles shares that humanness of the doubts and struggle, but bottom line, I know God is faithful and He is timely, and I'm so thankful for His goodness and His mercy.
I am grateful for these that have shared their stories with us, and they help us understand what it's like for us to be in a mysterious world, and what it's like to be in a really bad place, and then to discover that God will see us through those bad places. This has kind of been the theme as we've talked about the book of Job over the past several weeks. We began, you may remember when we began, Job was a wealthy man. Job was a man of faith. Job was a man of virtue. But then some really bad stuff happened to Job. His children were killed in a storm. All of his possessions, his animals, were taken away from him. And Job found himself in a really bad place. And when you find yourself in one of those places, as Job did, he was disoriented. He did not know which way to turn and what to do. He was just kind of disoriented, totally discombobulated. And then the week after that, we heard Job kind of walking back and forth, planning what he was going to say to God when he got his audience with God. And he was going to say to God, you know, God, I do not deserve this. I'm a good man. I don't deserve this. And even though he planned his conversation with God, God was silent. Or at least that's Job's experience. Job experienced the silence of God from his perspective. And it was a tough place to be. And then last week we heard that God was finally speaking to Job. But the only problem was Job had some expectations about what he wanted God to say, what he wanted God to do. He had some expectations for God, but God did not meet his expectations. God did not do anything that Job expected. What God did do is essentially say to Job, Job, I am God and you are Job. I am the one in charge of the universe. Where were you, God says, when I created the heavens and the earth? Do you cause the sun to rise in the morning? Do you cause the moon to shine at night? Where were you, Job? I am God. Who do you think you are trying to tell me what to do and how I'm supposed to do things? Job was silenced by God's response. And then today, we read of Job being restored. We read of Job being restored. But before we talk about that, I have to ask you a question. Have you ever looked at something that you have looked at over and over and over and over, and then one day you look at that something and you see something that looks totally different? You see something that it's almost like you've never seen it before. You ever done anything like that? Okay, let me give you an example from my own life. I'm going to see the picture up here, the photo. I'm just going to ask you, what do you see in the photo? Tell me, seriously, tell me. What do you see? You see a sign that says fresh produce. You see a sign that says tomatoes. Some of you, if you're looking really good, you might see a illustration of a watermelon back in the background. Yeah? Is that what you see? Well, let me tell you about something that happened to me when I must have been 16 or 17 years old. I don't remember where we were. I don't remember where we were going. What I do remember is that I was in the car with my mom and my dad. And we are traveling down the road and we see a sign similar to this. This is not the exact sign, but it's a similar sign that we saw traveling down the road. And I remarked to my mom and dad, what are tomatoes? What are tomatoes? Have you ever seen a tomato? And my parents started laughing. What are tomatoes? They laughed at me. But that is a word, tomato, that I had seen my entire life. I know how to spell it. Whatever font it is in, whatever size the font it is, whatever, if it's hand painted or it's printed on a page with a fancy printer. It is spelled the same way and it is pronounced the same way all the time. But on that particular day, what I saw was the word tomato. Now think about it. Sometimes we look at things and we see something totally different than we've ever seen before. You're driving down the road, for instance, and you remark to the person sitting next to you, when did they paint that house yellow? And the person sitting next to you says, that house has always been yellow. You know what I'm talking about? Sometimes we have experiences where we see things differently than we've ever seen before. Or sometimes, from our perspective, in our experiences of life, there are things that we see through certain lenses. An example of that might be we have an experience early on in our life. Maybe it's a good experience, maybe it's a bad experience, but we have that experience in a certain context, in a certain setting, and all of that. And every time we find ourselves in a similar setting or context, we expect that which happened back then to happen. Or we have a perspective expecting that this is the way it's going to be this time, just like it was the last time. You with me? You know what I'm talking about? Okay. We have a perspective on things that is based upon something that may have happened in the past. We have a perspective on things because of something we may have seen in the past. And we expect it to be the same today as it was back then. Our lesson from the Old Testament, from the book of Job, says that Job was restored. In fact, what it says is that Job, in chapter 42, verse 10, it says, "The Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends." But what I want to propose to you today is that Job's restoration, in large part, was a change in perspective. A change in perspective. Looking at something differently. And let me go on to kind of give you some talk about a little bit. In verse 10, it says the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. And if you read further in that verse, or in that chapter, you read that not only did Job have 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, but also that the things that he had lost, the possessions that he had lost, returned to him in a double portion. Earlier he had 7,000 sheep, and today, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Job, he has 14,000 sheep. 3,000 camels before, and now he has 6,000 camels. 500 oxen before, and now he has 1,000 oxen. And the same with donkeys. 500 donkeys before, and 1,000 donkeys now. But what I want to propose to you is that restoration is not about our possessions. Restoration is not about the things that we have lost or the things that we may gain. Restoration is not about the things that we hold on to. It is not about the possessions we have, how many we have, or anything like that. What I want to propose to you today is that Job's restoration was about being content with his life. About Job being okay with who he was and whose he was. About Job being okay in his relationship with the Lord. About Job being okay about where he was in life. Being content with that. Being okay with that. Being comfortable with that. In Job's case, what happened to Job is Job, over the process of time, gained a new perspective. Gained a new understanding of who he was in relationship to God. He began to realize that God was God, and he was Job. In verse 2 of chapter 42, Job says, "I know that you can do all things," speaking to the Lord, "and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." You see, in the beginning, all Job could see was his suffering. All Job could see and experience was how he had lost pretty much everything that defined who he was. And Job thought to himself, this is not fair. I am a righteous man. I am a good man. I have been faithful. But what Job did not realize is that God was God and he was Job. And so in verse 2 of chapter 42, Job finally realizes there is no plan of the Lord's that can be thwarted. So what does all this mean? It means that Job came to a place in his life where he realized that God was powerful and that God was so much more powerful and all-powerful in ways that he could never be. And that if he put his trust in the Lord, life would be very different than if he depended upon his things and his possessions and all of that. He also realized that nothing is impossible for God. Nothing is impossible for God. And then also that God's plans and purposes in the world cannot be thwarted. There is nothing that we as human beings can do, even though God has given us a free will, there is nothing that we as human beings can do to thwart God's plans. God has a purpose in the world and a plan for the world, and we cannot thwart that. And perhaps most importantly, Job learned that he's not the center of the universe. You know, there are some of us that think, I used to think this, there are some of us that think that we are the center of the universe and that everything revolves around us and everybody ought to, because we are so special, everybody ought to treat us in a certain way. And Job came to a place in his life where he realized he was not the center of the universe. God was the center of the universe. And so, how is this helpful to all of us? Well, perhaps it's helpful when we begin to realize that when we find ourselves in these bad places, that God will see us through. We didn't read them, but the chapter 42, verses 7 through 9 are also a part of this lesson. And in that part of the chapter, if you go back and read it, you'll discover that God is having a conversation with Job's friends. And God is chiding Job's friends for not being really helpful in this process, for saying things to Job about who God is that were incorrect. That somehow God was punishing Job because of this or because of that or because his children did something. That's the reason why Job was experiencing all these things. God chided Job's friends. But the interesting thing, where we begin to read again in chapter 42 at the end there, we realize that in verse 10 it says, "The Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends." That's what Job did for his friends. His friends who had not prayed for him, Job prayed for. And the prayer is not there, but I wonder if perhaps the reason, or what the prayer may have begun something like this: "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Words perhaps that you've heard before from Jesus on the cross. "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Perhaps that's the prayer that Job prayed for his friends. So, what's the message for us in all of this? I think the message for us is that when we find ourselves in times of trouble, when we find ourselves in places of pain, when we find ourselves in places of heartache, that so oftentimes it is so easy to get focused on all the pain and the heartache and not realize that God will see us through. I thought about that a lot yesterday as I saw the news about the horrible tragedy in Pittsburgh, where a man came into the Tree of Life Synagogue there in Pittsburgh, in the same neighborhood where Mr. Rogers lived, if I'm right, Nikki. A man came into the synagogue and killed people coming to worship. And I thought how horrible that must be and the pain that they must experience in that situation. But friends, I think what Job says to us when we find ourselves in those kinds of places is that I am the God of the universe, and I will see you through from this place to this new place. And that when you get to this new place, you'll realize with a change in perspective that life is different, but also life is okay, and you will be okay. How do I know that? You know, oftentimes near the end of the sermon, I try to share some story that illustrates this fact, that whatever the message is, whatever the key point is, that sort of thing. But the reality is today, I don't have another story. What I do have, though, is you. And as I look back over getting to know you for the past 2.5 years that I've been your pastor, I realize in talking with so many of you that you too have been in those bad places. Many of you have been in those bad places, though places which were places of pain and heartache and struggle. Some of you have lost loved ones. Some of you have lost jobs. Some of you have dealt with business downturns. Some of you have had relationship issues that have been so painful and debilitating. And yet, at the same time, as people of faith, I have watched you stay strong and firm in your faith, and I've watched you go from the place that you have been to the place where you are today. And you've done that because you realized that God is God, and no purposes of God can be thwarted. So, if you are in one of those places today, I invite you to look around at these who are your fellow followers of Jesus Christ. To look around at these people, many of whom have been in those bad places and now are in this other place. Like Greg English that spoke to us just a few moments ago. God will be with us through these struggles, through these turmoils, and see us through from the darkness to the light. Thanks be to God.